Hey you witches, it's Taya here, and I've got Luna with me. She's just laying on the bed beside me, and hopefully she'll stay there. We're going to do another episode of Folklore Friday today, and I'm going to read to you True Thomas, or Thomas the Rhymer. It's a very well-known Scottish folk tale. I have it here. I've got it in a couple places. So I've got it here in my anthology of Scottish folk tales. It doesn't say on the front who compiled it, but anyways, Anthology of Scottish Folk Tales, and it's actually written in like a Scottish brogue, so I'm not going to read you the whole story from here, but I'll just read you the introduction just so you can get a feel for how the story sounds. I just love the way it's written in here. I just think it would be kind of hard to listen to the whole story all read in a Scottish brogue, but it starts out a long time ago on a particularly warm day. Thomas Learmonth frae Ercildoune decided to go and visit a friend who lived up the Eldon Hills. He fancied himself as a bit o' a wandering minstrel, so he took his lute with him. It was such a hot day that, having made his way up the slope o' Huntly Bank that lay at the foot o' the Eldon Hills, he decided to seek the shade o' the hawthorn tree there as a place to sit and rest for a while. So you can kind of hear, it's actually written, so instead of he, it's hey, H-A-E. So anyways, I love this one here. It's called The Anthology of Scottish Folk Tales. But I'm actually going to read to you the same story, but out of an illustrated treasury of Scottish mythical creatures, again by Teresa Breslin. So this is part of her 3-part series. Again, they're written for children, but I feel like it's just a little easier to understand if I were to read it from here than to read it all in the brogue, because there's no way to read that other one without putting on the accent. So we're going to read True Thomas, or Thomas the Rhymer. So it says, the tale of Thomas the Rhymer, or True Thomas, is very old indeed. When he was a boy, King James I of Scotland heard stories of True Thomas. So this King James I lived from 1394 to 1437. Thomas lived in the Scottish borders in a place once known as Ercildoune, now called Earlston. His tale, sung in border ballads, was retold by Walter Scott, among many others. I find it poignant as, once he's received the gift of truth-telling, Thomas loses the power to invent stories. It's a bit of a long one, so stay with me. It's a good one, though. Nigh on 700 years ago, in the borderlands of Scotland, in the village of Ercildoune, lived a young man named Thomas. Thomas was a minstrel. He wrote poems and set them to music. At feasts and fairs, he would play upon his small harp to entertain folk. His verse made hearts soar, while his music shimmered through the air like a rainbow arching across the earth. His songs were so melodic that he was known both near and far as Thomas the Rhymer. One warm summer morning, Thomas left his room in Learmont Tower and went a-wandering by the Huntly Burn. His father was holding a midsummer feast on the morrow, and Thomas had promised to have a special ballad ready to celebrate the occasion, but the rhymes he required would not come to his mind. The sun blazed yellow in the sky above him, and in every dale and dell of the border countryside, trees and flowers bloomed, red, blue, green, and gold. Thomas found a shady spot under the Eildon tree, and taking his harp in his hand, he strummed upon the strings. As the day wore on, his head began to ache, for the words still eluded him. His eyelids drooped, and he lay down on the grassy bank and fell asleep. In the gloaming light of half-dusk, Thomas awoke with a start. It was late but not fully dark, for it was Midsummer's Eve, the time of the summer solstice, when the veil between the world of mortals and the world of the other people is drawn aside, the other people being the fair folk. Thomas sat up, wondering what had caused him to waken. He heard a ringing, singing sound and thought it to be the tinkling noise of water dashing over stones in the nearby Huntly Burn. Moonlight shone around the Eildon tree, and Thomas saw riding towards him a lady on a snow-white horse with a silver crown resting upon her head. She was robed in a flowing dress and cloak of emerald green. On her feet were velvet slippers with tiny bells sewn on the toes. Bells hung from the horse trappings and were plaited into its tail and mane. As she moved through the wood, the green glade echoed with their ringing, singing sound. Thomas, the lady called his name in a sweet, low voice. Who are you? Replied Thomas. that you so readily speak my name, yet I know not yours?" "I am the Queen of Fairyland," the lady replied. She beckoned to him. "You must catch my stirrup and come with me." Thomas thought the lady was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen, and he had no hesitation in doing as she told him. He leapt to his feet. Slinging his harp over his shoulder, he grasped the stirrup of her horse. The Queen of Fairyland bent her head and smiled at Thomas, and they went on their way. No word was spoken between Thomas and the Fairy Queen as they journeyed together. Now, one way this story differs from the one from other tellings is in the other tellings, he plays her a song and she grants him a wish. And he wishes for a kiss. And she says, "Well, if I grant you a kiss, then you have to come with me and you'll be bound to me for 7 years." So they've kind of skipped that part in the children's story. And he's just going to go with her because she's so beautiful. They traveled over a great river, and in the water swam fish of many colors that Thomas had never seen before. They traveled through a thick forest, and among the trees roamed wild beasts of a kind that Thomas had never seen before. They traveled past a city, and in the streets walked people of a size and stature that Thomas had never seen before. His head was so filled with wonderment at the sights he saw that his senses reeled and speech stuck in his throat. Then they came to a place where the road branched in 3 directions. The Queen of Fairyland drew rein on her horse, and the ringing, singing sound of the bells stopped. Thomas looked at the first path. It was a rough track overgrown with thorn bushes. "What path is that?" he asked. "The path of righteousness," replied the Fairy Queen. The second path was paved with smooth and shining cobblestones. "What path is that?" Thomas asked. "The path of wickedness," replied the Fairy Queen. The third path was a bonny road that wound like a ribbon towards the Eldon Hills. "What path is that?" Thomas asked. The Fairy Queen laughed softly, and urging on her horse, she rode along the third path. "Where are you taking me?" Thomas asked, thrilled and frightened in equal measure. I think it's something interesting to note there, right? That the path of righteousness is overgrown with thorn bushes. It's not an easy path to travel. Whereas the path to wickedness is paved with smooth and shining cobblestones. So the path of wickedness is very easy to follow. But they take the third path. The Queen of Fairyland laughed again. "Through the hollow hill to the land of everlasting time." That's where she's taking him. Soon they arrived at the bottom of a cliff, and the rock before them was flat and smooth with no crack or fissure upon it. The Queen of Fairyland drew rein on her horse, and the ringing, singing sound of the bells stopped. "I will give you a warning, Thomas the Rhymer, and you must pay heed to what I say." Thomas looked into the eyes of the Fairy Queen and listened to what she told him in her sweet, low voice. "If you wish to return to your country and your kin, then you must neither speak nor sup unless we are alone together." So no speaking or eating unless he's alone with the Elf Queen. Thomas was afraid, for he dearly loved his homeland of Scotland and his relatives and friends, and he feared to be parted forever from his country and his kin. But he desperately wanted to go through the hollow hill and see the land of everlasting time, so he nodded in agreement. "Then you may enter the realm of fairy, but first you must bind your promise with a kiss." "This I will do willingly," said Thomas, "if you will make me a promise that you will take me back to my home in Ercildoune after I have counted the passage of 7 days." The Fairy Queen nodded in agreement. Thomas kissed the Queen of Fairyland to bind his promise to her that he would neither speak nor sup unless they were alone together. The Queen of Fairyland kissed Thomas the Rhymer to bind her promise to him that she would return him to his home in Ercildoune after he had counted the passage of 7 days. Then the Queen of Fairyland raised her hand and pointed at the flat, smooth surface of the rock with no crack or fissure upon it. The cliff face shuddered, a hidden door swung open, and the Fairy Queen and Thomas entered in. With a ringing, singing sound, they trotted through Fairyland. The scent of honey filled the air, and flowers were strewn in their path wherever they went. The Fairy Queen led Thomas to her palace of gold, and there he rested. Every day was spent in composing verse with the Fairy Queen, and every night was spent in making music. It was easy for Thomas to remember to neither speak nor sup unless he and the Fairy Queen were alone together. but it was not easy for Thomas to remember about the passage of time. Such was the entertainment, and so full was his happiness, that Thomas almost forgot to count the days. To make sure he didn't overstay, every morning he strummed upon his harp, and every evening he plucked out one of the strings. On the morning after he had plucked out the 7th string, no tune came from his harp when he tried to play it. 3 times Thomas tried, and 3 times the harp remained silent. There's that magic 3. Then Thomas understood that it was time for him to go home to Ercildoune. He spoke to the Queen of Fairyland. As I have kept my promise to you to neither speak nor sup unless you and I were alone together, it is time for you to keep your promise to take me back to my home in Ercildoune. There were tears in the eyes of the Fairy Queen as she replied, "A promise made and bound with a kiss must be kept. I said I would return you to your home in Ercildoune, and that I will do." No word was spoken between Thomas and the Fairy Queen as they journeyed together. Mounted on the snow-white horse with a ringing, singing sound, they left the golden palace and went through the hollow hill and out of the hidden door in the face of the cliff. Leaving the realm of fairy and the land of everlasting time, they trotted away from the Eldon hills until they came to the place where the road branched in 3 directions. The Queen of Fairyland drew rein on her horse, and the ringing, singing sound of the bells stopped. Thomas looked at the first path, which was the rough track overgrown with thorn bushes. "I do not choose the path of righteousness," he said. Thomas looked at the second path, which was paved with smooth and shining cobblestones. "I do not choose the path of wickedness," he said. Thomas looked at the third path, which was a bonny road that wound like a ribbon away from the Eldon hills. Before he could say anything more, the Fairy Queen laughed softly, and urging on her horse, she rode along the third path in the direction of Ercildoune. They travelled past the city, where in the streets walked people of a size and stature that Thomas had seen before. They travelled through the thick forests, where among the trees roamed wild beasts of a kind that Thomas had seen before. They travelled over the great river, where the water swam fish of many colours that Thomas had seen before. His head was so filled with wonderment at the sights he saw that his senses reeled and speech stuck in his throat. In the gloaming light of half-dusk they reached the Huntley burn and the grassy bank below the Eldon tree. The Queen of Fairyland drew rein on her horse, and the ringing, singing sound of the bells stopped. "Ah," Thomas thought aloud, "I must find my father and apologize 7 times for being 7 days late for his midsummer feast." 7 by 7, that's another magic number. The Queen of Fairyland bent her head and smiled at Thomas. "More than 7 times 7 will you have to apologize to your father." "It will break my heart to leave you," Thomas told her, for he had fallen in love with the Fairy Queen. "As it will mine for the same reason," replied the Fairy Queen. "Will I never see you again?" Thomas wept. "We might yet be together," said the Fairy Queen. "When the time comes for you to return to me, I will send you a sign." "You must bind your promise with a kiss," said Thomas. "That I will do," said the Fairy Queen, "and in exchange for all the songs and music you have shared with me, I will give a gift to you." And so the Queen of Fairyland kissed Thomas and said, "The kiss I give to say goodbye ensures your tongue will never lie." Thomas ran home, bursting into the great hall of Learmont Tower. He flung himself at his father's feet, saying, "Dearest father, I am sorry that I am 7 days late for your midsummer feast." His father staggered back in amazement. "Dearest son," he said, "it is not 7 days, but 7 years since you went missing from under the Eldon tree." Then Thomas understood why the Fairy Queen had said, "More than 7 times 7 will you have to apologize to your father." Thomas's father was overjoyed to see him and bade him come to the table where he was dining with one of their neighbours. Thomas played his harp and tried to make up a verse to entertain them. The friend seemed pleased enough with his efforts, but to Thomas the song sounded empty of meaning and magic. "I regret my wife was not fit to travel to hear your wonderful music," his father's friend told him. Thomas looked up. As the words came from the man's mouth, Thomas could see the inside of his house. A woman sat beside a cradle that held a newborn babe. "Oh, she would not want to leave your baby child," said Thomas, and the man gave Thomas a strange look. "How is it that you have news of the birth of my baby son when you have been gone from these parts for 7 years?" "I do not know," said Thomas. "Does your son sleep in a cradle of oak wood?" "He does," replied the man, "but lots of cradles are made of stout oak wood. Does it have a canopy with your family crest embroidered on it?" "It does," said the man. "It is my wife who did the needlework, for she is skilled in this craft." "Does your wife have the most lovely hair, black like a raven's wing?" The man's face flushed in anger. "You are too familiar with your words about my wife." "It is what I can see," said Thomas. Thomas's father cried out, "Dearest son, why do you speak this way? You are in danger of insulting our honored guest." But Thomas could not stop, for the fairy queen had given him the gift of truth-telling. "The kiss I give to say goodbye ensures your tongue will never lie." "I see your wife in her bedchamber," said Thomas. The man stood up and reached for his sword. "I see your son and your wife in the bedchamber," Thomas went on. "I see the scaffolding outside the window, left by the builder repairing the roof. I see a small fire burning in the brazier. I see it tip over in the wind, and the wood of the scaffolding set alight." "Fetch my horse," the man shouted, and he raced from Learmont Tower and rode off at full speed. Upon arriving at his house an hour later, the man rescued his wife and child just as the flames flickered against the bedroom window. As news of the incident spread, people realized that Thomas had foretold the fire before it had actually begun. From that day forth, instead of creating his own stories and songs, Thomas spoke only of what he saw in his mind's eye. He wrote down these visions. Many of them came true, and some have yet to happen. Thomas's fame spread throughout Scotland and into the countries beyond. Nobles and knights, merchants and millers, and ordinary working folk visited him in Learmont Tower to seek his advice. In addition to being named Thomas the Rhymer, he also became known as True Thomas. Time passed, not 7 hours, not 7 days, not 7 years, but 70 years. Thomas grew weary of bearing the burden of prophecy. His spirit yearned to wander once again in the realms of his imagination. His heart longed to recapture the magic of making music. More and more often he would climb to the top of Learmont Tower, look beyond the Eildon tree and sigh, "I think the Queen of Fairyland has forgotten her promise to come and take me back to the land of everlasting time." One day, on the eve of winter solstice, when the veil between the world of mortals and the world of the other people is drawn aside, a hunter came running into the hall of Learmont Tower. "There's a white stag standing near the Huntly burn. I stretched my bow to shoot an arrow at it, and suddenly my arm froze, and for a minute I could not move. When I recovered, I knew I must tell True Thomas this news." Thomas left his room in Learmont Tower and walked to the Huntly burn. Underneath the Eildon tree was a pure white hind, pure white deer, female deer. On her head rested a silver crown. Thomas went close to the magical creature, and the shape of Thomas became the shape of the tree covered in white frost, and then slowly became the shape of a pure white hart, a male deer. Hart and hind stood by each other. They looked one last time at Ercildoune and the Eildon tree, and then they bounded away together towards the Eildon hills. Snow began to fall, and from afar came echoing the ringing, singing sound of bells. So, lovely story, and I really like how it kind of shares that idea that, I mean, there's lots of different things throughout it that I kind of have mentioned, but the idea that you can be granted a gift by the fairy, but that it comes at a cost. And for Thomas, the cost was that he was no longer able to invent stories. He couldn't use his imagination to create songs and stories and kind of entertain people, but now he's able to see the future, and that became what he was known for. So, beautiful story, very famous Scottish story. Lots of different versions out there, but yeah, that's one of my favorites. Thanks for sharing with me. We'll catch you in the next one.